Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, so let me just reiterate this marathon example that I've been playing with, that I know from talking outside of this, I think there's parts of this you like and parts of it you don't like. And so here's sort of my premise on where we are culturally right now, how it looks. Specifically speaking of some of the things that, right now Courtney and I are having a conversation right during the COVID sort of crisis, and right around the George Floyd incident happened, 2 months ago, and the Black Lives Matter protests are going on. So this is part of the conversation we're having. Now, before we get into this, for those of you listening, just understand most of the commentary we're going to make has nothing to do with George Floyd or Black Lives Matters necessarily. It's just that this is the context in which we're talking, so we may use it. But I oftentimes think about equality in this way. At least it's a model I've been developing. I want to just share it with you, and then I want us to just have the kind of conversations you and I have about what about this is right or wrong. So imagine, as a culture, society, we're essentially all running a marathon race. And so in a sense, in a marathon race, everyone theoretically is supposed to start at the same starting line, right? So in a sense, and there's a defined course, right? So if you want to run this marathon, you start at the same time. Once you cross the sort of beginning line, your time starts. You run the race. Everyone runs the same course. And then you get to the end and you have a time. Now, obviously, there's going to be people who are better at running that marathon than others. Some people will be fit to run. Others will be less fit to run. Some will have practiced running. Others not so much. And so there's a whole lot that goes into whether or not someone can sort of complete this race. But the idea is that everyone should be able to compete on equal footing. And at least that's sort of my idea. And here's the sort of sense of how I see this. Now, when you're running a race, you have access to, sort of different things. Like there's water along the way that the course sort of puts out for people. You could choose to have the water or not. But what if there was a situation where certain people running this race had obstacles put in their way? For example, there were certain people on the sidelines that whenever they saw this particular person run by, they started chasing him around or tackled him or tried to shoot him with a BB gun, or I don't know, was able to put like a trap door in the middle of the road to where the person fell through, or was trying to trip them, or somehow trying to disrupt certain people's running of the race while leaving others alone. Not even necessarily helping others along, but just leaving others alone and putting obstacles in place, confusing signs, barriers, ways of trying to trip this other group up. For me, and sort of my personal opinion, where I'm coming from, I actually see that this is very much the case in my mind, with my worldview, when I take a look at African Americans, let's say, in the United States. I feel like we have systemically placed obstacles in their way that make it more difficult for them to run the race. And so I'll stop there, and I want to see how you, sort of answer this, because I think you have an interesting take. And Courtney and I oftentimes have these really sort of back and forth so we can learn from each other. And she has an interesting perspective on things. So I'm just curious, does this model the way I'm presenting this? Do you say, yeah, Jay, that's exactly how I see it too? Or do you see it very differently? And how do you see it?
Okay, so there is a lot to unpack in this. You talk about equality, right? So a lot of times, I think we'll break down some terms first, because a lot of times people think about equality, they talk about equity, and there's equality of opportunity, and there's equity. They're very different things.
Okay.
Equity means like we want to have equality of outcome. We want to basically rig the system so that everybody finishes at the same place. In, let's say, the marathon, they finish the same, they all finish, they all have the same time.
So there's no winners, no losers.
Exactly. You know, everybody gets the gold star, the blue ribbon, whatever. So that's the premise behind equity. Equality, equal opportunity is different. And equal opportunity is, I think, a very productive conversation. However, it's really complex. So I think that this is where people get a little bit, they start to conflate the terms, and they think that there's a simple answer. And so in the marathon example that you presented,
which may be a very bad example, just because, but let's go with it for now, and maybe there's a better example.
Let's go with it. So for this particular example, it's a good example in the sense of that. So you talked about, you likened it to African Americans in this country and how they've had obstacles thrown at them. We're gonna not address the systemic issue for a minute, because that's a whole other Pandora's box to open up. But in terms of obstacles being thrown their way, right? And absolutely, that may be totally valid. However, in this particular analogy that you've used, I would actually argue a lot of African Americans are going to have an advantage. I mean, when we look at the Olympics, we look at the runners who win, most of them are African American or, of that descent, right? They have a genetic advantage.
So you're speaking of the idea that the Kenyans, for example, have, certain physiological attributes that may allow them to better run the race. And if you're an African American descended from Kenyans, then maybe you have an advantage in that race.
And, some people may say that's a stereotype, but it didn't come from nowhere. We look at the results of the Olympics. Jung would say that if you wanted to know the intention or the origin of something, to look at the outcome. And that's probably, pretty good assessment a lot of the time. So in that example, they may actually have an advantage. However, I think there's a much more interesting conversation to be had, and that one is that how do we account for all the potential disadvantages? So you're talking about potential disadvantages for African Americans. So this is hypothetically a marathon being run only in this country.
And of course, I brought up African Americans just because of the current political state.
But that's just it, right? So how many other disadvantages are there to account for? You talked about like being able to see the signs and whatnot. I never like to play that card, but for me that would be really difficult. Like I usually run slower just so that I make sure I have people in front of me and I know where I'm going.
Just so those of you listening understand, Courtenay is blind in one eye and also has to read lips to hear as well. So she's speaking of her own limitations. So in this particular race, you would be at a disadvantage in that regard to see what direction. So
Yeah. Okay. And there would be lots of other disadvantages that I personally have, for those who don't know, like I was, born with hypertonic limbs, I have a child-sized lung capacity, I had graphic and fine motor impairments. So, there's lots of challenges that I would have in running this race. But how are they going to account for all of those disadvantages I may personally have,
Or even in another degree, like, look at me, like me running a race built the way I'm built, I'm going to have disadvantages as well. Part of the thing I'm speaking about, though, is what if we all go in, like, maybe someone's prone to an ankle, has weak ankles, or there's all kinds of things. However, certain people, it's sort of like the things inside of ourselves, I guess, our individual sort of dysfunctions and disadvantages, right? And then there's the systemic, and which I know you wanted to put that aside, but then there's sort of like groups that if we're putting obstacles only in particular people's way, like I essentially say, every individual is going to have their own dysfunction, disadvantages, or advantages, and sort of a performance, functional attributes that make them great at something. So, but putting all that aside, if we put someone, let's say, even if they're really good at running this race, but we put obstacles in their place and make it more difficult for them, we are essentially not, in my mind, operating via equal opportunity.
So if you put obstacles, like, are you specifically putting obstacles that only certain people are going to have
only certain groups. So let's switch it and let's take African Americans out of it. Let's just say people with hearing impairment, or this would be you, right? Or let's say you're this cute little short person that's what 5'2", 5'1", right? So let's say for short people, right? Let's say that we basically create obstacles for short people in this race. For example, I don't know, maybe. There's something that we can do that interrupts short people, therefore, and we target them to try to keep them from finishing, right? So in that particular case, yes, there's tall people that have disadvantages. There's short people that have disadvantages. People with tight dysfunctional joints and hypermobile, mobile, and type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers and all these things. But if we target one group of people, the short people, are we not essentially saying, we are against equal opportunity if we allow that to go on?
Absolutely. But I don't see that there is no circumstance where I see that happens.
In greater culture.
Yeah, exactly. Where we intentionally hold a specific person back. And even then, even if we were supposed, let's say the marathon example, we supposedly said, we're going to create obstacles where the short people are going to be greatly disadvantaged. And I'm trying to think of how we would actually do that.
Yeah.
Because here is just the thing. You've got those, some of these really, really gifted runners who are really, really small. And the way they compensate is by spending more time in the air. They're smaller, they're lighter, they're very agile. They actually take really small steps. And they end up running faster, and they have really great endurance, and they can go faster, and a lot of the time they end up winning.
Yeah.
So, it's not always the longest stride that wins. Yeah. So even in an example like that, where you're intentionally trying to hold back a certain group, the problem is that when you try and break things down into groups, that game is endless. Where do you stop with that? Because so now we're talking about, if we take the short people, now what about short men? What about short women? What about age? What about different races?
Yeah.
What about how long they've been running? What about genetic athleticism?
Yeah. And here's an interesting thing. If as we're following this conversation, and actually, I actually think this is getting to be a better example, because I have another place where I think you may agree with, and we'll go into it. But where this is essentially going is, if you're looking at, I think we're coming at this from two different things, right? I think from my perspective, and I'm going to switch here in a minute to another game, because I think it brings us to a nice talking point. But I think what you're saying is you're making the leap, and correct me if I'm wrong, where you're essentially saying, well, then what are we going to do? I'm not talking about changing the race to accommodate people. I'm simply saying, let's make sure that we enforce the right race so people don't have obstacles. I'm not saying that we need to make it so that the race is, that the short people can finish at the same time that a taller person finishes. Right. I'm just simply saying, let's do what we can in this particular race to make sure that we're not putting undue obstacles on certain people to the degree that which we can. And here's what this would look like. So in culture, because this was really an analogy for culture. But if we take culture, let's take something that is oftentimes seen as something that disproportionately affected African Americans as culture. Let's take the Nixon, sort of Reagan, sort of war on drugs type of thing. And it wasn't just Nixon and Reagan. It was also Clinton and, Carter. But there was this sort of time period, Nixon, Reagan, Carter, Bush 1, Clinton, that, we were all about the war on drugs, right? And so these particular laws that we put in place, and you mentioned intentionality, I don't know that anyone ever said, let's intentionally target the African American community. I don't actually believe that. Some people listening to this might. I just simply say they did get targeted by these particular laws. In other words, we inadvertently, or whether intentionally or not, they had these obstacles put in their place that made life more difficult for that society, in my opinion. and that had real ramifications for the numbers of African Americans we see in prison, the number of felons who couldn't get jobs after they came out of prison for nonviolent crimes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's where I was going with this marathon example. It doesn't have to be intentional, and I'm not even saying let's forget about like reparations or anything like that. That we are because you were harmed by this, we have to put in. That could get us in a whole mess of all the different things. I'm just saying, shouldn't we? And I'm wondering, and I don't want to put you on the spot either. I'm just saying, but I'm not asking you this. I'm saying is asking the question to the greater listeners who are listening to us right now. Shouldn't we do everything we can as a conscientious society to essentially say, let's not let's never put intentional obstacles to anybody to be able to achieve the quote American dream, and to the degree that we have discovered that we have unintentionally created obstacles through laws and other things, shouldn't we be working to remove those?
Sure, I 100% agree with we absolutely should work to do away with laws that disadvantage people once we've realized that they have. I like that you brought up the intentionality. I think a lot of times there's no way of knowing, there's no way of accounting for all the people that could be harmed by, a specific law that's implemented. I would actually argue that the Great Society, if we're talking about African Americans, that those laws did the most disservice to African Americans today. I think there's a lot that can be done and should be done to help that particular community. But I think the really interesting question is that I would love people to be having more of a conversation about how do we achieve more of an equal opportunity. It's not a simple answer.
Well, what's your answer? Because I think you have some ideas. I'm curious, like if you had to say, here's how I would see it. So I think let's just go back briefly and just say, I think you agree, let's not put obstacles. Intentionally or unintentionally. So intentionally never, but unintentionally it's going to happen. There's no way of getting around it. And when we see that, so I think we're in agreement there. And so now I want to know because what you're talking about, great society, a lot of people may not understand what that is, but you're speaking of Roosevelt and sort of the social securities and social safety nets that were put in place pre-World War II, right? So that's what, okay. So your belief is that something about that may not have been the best thing for society. So help us understand from your perspective, where you go, this would have been better, or this is how you think it should be.
So, a lot of people have kind of, I think, a misconception about different types of government structures. They jump to like capitalism, democracy, socialism, and they're very broad, sweeping generalizations, and there's a lot of nuances within them. So this country is actually a constitutional republic. We do have, democratic policies in the sense that, citizens are active and members of society. We can vote. We vote for representatives who we hope will represent our best interests, both on the municipal, local level, as well as federally. And then we also have a capitalistic free market that applies to a lot of our economic protocols. And so there's a lot of, I think, people put these terms on and they, have this sense of how that will solve things. And so there's a lot of debate about essentially government and how much government should be involved. And in this country, we have a constitution that is kind of like our backbone. And the Constitution says that it's not just policies and laws that have to be upheld, but it's actually based on a code of ethics. It was embedded in our Constitution was the Judeo-Christian values. And this is a very integral part, and I think in some ways unique part of definitely Western civilization and definitely of the United States of America. And some of these laws that were placed, like in the Great Society, they attribute to some of the breakdown of family and individual value. And those are two really fundamental components of our structure as a society, and that really attribute to our success and part of why people come here for the American dream, because there is that backbone, and that backbone is part of how people are able to succeed. So going back to like the different, how do we address the taking obstacles out of the way, it is a really complex question because there's no way to foresee all of the obstacles that may possibly impede somebody from succeeding. There are so many different variables. We have a couple of things that we know are predictors of likely success, but even those are less than 50% of guarantee. So we don't really know what are the obstacles that could be in the way. And we also don't know what are the different groups that could be targeted to help or, take disadvantages away from. So my solution is really that I feel like we would do better with government. I'm not like a nihilist. I'm not an anarchist. I don't want government like completely gone. I would not be, I'm not a utopianist in any capacity, not on the right or the left. Yeah. Sorry, the left.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah. You're not an extremist.
No, and just to clarify what I mean by extremes, I think when you get to either extreme, you're looking for a utopia. And, I'm an optimistic person, but I'm very much a pragmatist. Yeah. And, I recognize that there is no perfection. There's no perfect system. We're dealing with human beings. We're flawed. We're very flawed. I think we're incredible beings, but we're also fundamentally flawed. So we're not going to create a perfect system. However, what I really strongly opposed to is these people who they want to reject everything, and I call them destructionists, because it's this idea that we're going to destroy this society that we have and tear everything apart because it's just so terrible, it's evil, and we've done all these people such great harm. Okay, well, what is your solution? Like, where is the alternative? And I don't hear any of that. And I'm not saying that's a simple answer, but I would like people to focus more on that, because I personally believe that this society, no, it's not perfect, but there's a reason people, even the people who are so busy trying to take it down, people who are tearing it apart, complaining about all the evils of American society, they don't leave. Yeah. There's a reason there's a waiting list of millions of people to get into this country. And it's because it is still the American dream, arguably one of the best places in the world to be, with the most opportunity for hope and growth.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on this a little bit, because I think it's important. Here's the way I see it, and let me just, if I understand you really quickly, just because I like to do this, because as we talk about complex things, sometimes it can be sort of taken out of context. So if I'm hearing you, you're essentially saying a couple things here. You're essentially saying, listen, we as a country, the United States, are, we're a constitutional republic. We're not a pure sort of democracy. We never were meant to be that way. Judeo-Christian values were sort of built into this, despite the fact that written into the Constitution, and at least the ideals of separation of church and state and things like that.
But the values are embedded.
Right, but
so
the values,
you don't have to believe in it, in the religion itself, but the values are embedded.
Right.
Absolutely.
So we have that sort of going on, and then we sort of fast forward to sort of now, and you're essentially saying there that, what really bothers you is this idea that you feel like, in general, while we're not perfect as a country, we are the best of what, has to be out there, right? And I may have left some things out there, but in general, it sounds like sort of that's what you're saying.
General interest,
and also, it sounds like you're saying that, what really bothers you is the idea of people saying, we suck, tear it all down, especially in the current environment, tear everything down, to start over,
literally,
get rid of the police, like all this kind of stuff, right? Tearing statues down,
eradicate
stuff like
everything,
that. And so for me, I essentially go, I will say, here's my position on this. What I see is, I see it on both sides, right? On the one side, I see we're the best country, your kind of language, right? We're the best country, no one's better than us. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I agree that our values and, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. To me, I believe that is perhaps the greatest ideal ever put forward by a government, and we are responsible for that. However, I personally feel we are not doing it the best right now. I think there's other countries that are doing it better than us. So that's that's one thing where I'll say and at the same time, I also agree with you. The idea that we're so terrible that we need to tear everything down is also ridiculous to me. Mm-hmm. To me, I don't understand why people can't just simply say, we do have amazing ideals in this country. In fact, these ideals have changed the face of the earth, and many countries have adopted these ideas and ideals for the better. Yep. However, we are a work in progress, and so we can have the greatest ideals and also have an atrocious track record in certain areas. Both things can be true. The way I've always seen the United States is that we are the land of extremes in a sense. We are the fittest and the fattest. We are the smartest and the stupidest. We are one grand experiment. We are a work in process, right? So we are in process. And the idea is that if we as a country are in process and we as a human race are in process, then to me, I have a problem with either side of this. Like, to me, it's just say, where we are not living up to our ideals, let's point it out, get pissed off about it, try to change it, force those ideals. Be like, if we stand for this, then let's stand for this. Let's not be like, let's go back to some imaginary place when we were better. We weren't better in the 50s in my mind. We weren't better back in the day. We had slavery. We had, sexism and racism and all of these things. So on the one hand, while I would agree with sort of the idea of why, you don't tear down a system that has so much good as we do, but you also don't try to hold up a system that has so much bad as we have. And so to me, it's this gray zone in the middle where why can't people just say, you know what? We do have the greatest ideals on the planet. We are, and we are not living up to them. We are failing miserably in certain aspects of them. Why can't we say those two things? Why does it have to be one or the other?
So I would absolutely agree. I don't think it's one or the other. So I feel like we are absolutely a work in progress. That's what you were talking about. We're, as human beings, we're a work in progress. So, and we will always continue to be. Like I said before, I'm not a utopianist. I don't believe that exists. So we're never going to reach this like magical place or state of being or system. That's not going to happen. That's just not realistic. However, I do think that we have put forth the best system compared to, because my question is always compared to what? Compared to what else, right? Yeah. So I feel like it's when you say we're not upholding those and that, we shouldn't go back to saying that some other time was better. I don't think anybody's saying like we want to revert back. I mean,
isn't that Donald Trump's whole campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again"? It wasn't as great. Like, if we're a work in progress, you know what I mean? So like, in a sense, make America great again to somebody who didn't have such a great America back then, right? Like, so think about what it means to a woman or a black person or a gay or a lesbian to say, make America great again, when they're like, hey, back when you think America was great.
Make America great again, you made a lot of assumptions right there.
Go. Yeah.
Like what make America great again? So when was it again, right?
Right.
You jumped back to a specific time.
I do. My thought process is that they're talking about the 50s, 40s, and 50s.
And that's not necessarily the case. So I don't.
So what are they talking about? Do you know? Like, what when they say "Make America Great"? What are they talking about?
I can address that. Mm-hmm. I can address that. I do feel like.
By the way, not that I don't even know if you're a Trump supporter or anything. I'm like, it's just a conversation. But yeah, go ahead.
And I will say that I think that on either side, the Trump bashing or idealizing is not a very interesting conversation, quite honestly. Because there was a time that preceded Trump. There's going to be a time that after Trump. Yeah. And
if you're a team think person, you're always going to find people who are just bashing the other team just because it's the other team.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's not a very interesting or productive conversation because it doesn't address like a lot of the nuances of society.
I actually agree with that. For sure.
And it just, like you said, it's a collectivist type of attack, and it's a very, I think, superficial attack that not very interesting. It's really easy to, as I was saying before, tear down. So it's really easy to point out somebody's flaws. I mean, we all have them, like I can give you a very long list of my own, and whatnot.
And I can too. Although I think anyone listening to this podcast probably knows sort of a little bit about my political sort of affiliation. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but I will say just from I'm not even going to talk policy, and you don't need to. I think people already know this, but at least for me, in terms of personality, I'm very big on because of some of my own shortcomings in life. I've learned hard lessons, and I I have a disdain for the personality of a Trump. That's not even speaking of his. And I know that it's going to make me very unpopular with certain people on this podcast and certain others. But I also, and people who know me also know, it wouldn't matter if it was a Democrat or Republican. People who behave like that, I don't.
I hear this criticism a lot, and I'll say this, and then I'd like to address the other thing because I don't think
because we can get off into it. Yeah.
But I will say this, that I know a lot of people don't feel this way, and I understand that. But for me, I don't look at the president as somebody who I'm picking for a friend or somebody I'm going to socialize with. I'm really
or someone you
looking
need
at
to like personally.
Yeah. I really don't. And that's not to say I like him, dislike him, because that's kind of irrelevant to me. Really, what's relevant is what is he going to do for this country? What is the alternative? What does he stand for in terms of principles, values? What policies is he going to uphold?
Well, we know his values, but you're talking policies, right?
Well, I'm talking values in terms of societal and ideological. Really values from a political, philosophical perspective. Is really more of what I'm addressing, not his values and his personal interaction.
And it's an interesting point, right? Of everybody listening, in a sense, this stance that you take, which is certainly I'm not gonna evaluate my politicians from the standpoint of whether I want them to be my friends or not. I'm just gonna evaluate them from the standpoint of, do I think they're gonna make the country better in the long run? That I think what you're saying is, and again, I think what you're saying is that is a better place to start, because we can find faults with everyone, and then it just turns into, I don't like the person, even though they might do, there are probably plenty of people who liked Hitler. He was a vegetarian and an environmentalist. So
he loved his dog. He loved Ava.
I see what you're saying.
And I mean, the way I look at it too, I remember this as an actress. I would always, I can be very sensitive. I can take things very personally, but people always found it very interesting that when it came to professionally, whether it be as an actress or in business, I really don't. I'm very able to compartmentalize and separate.
Just all about the work.
Yeah. And I remember as an actress going in for these auditions, and, I knew that sometimes I would give my best performance. I would know that. In my heart, I could feel it. And they wouldn't pick me, or, or they would trash it. And, I even on a performance, too, this would happen. And I realized that sometimes you're going up to audition and the casting director will take one look at me, and within the first 5 seconds, I remind him of his ex-girlfriend who screwed him over, and he's already projected all these things onto me that have nothing to do with me and that I have zero control over. And it just boiled down to, he didn't like me. And I have no control over that. And there's absolutely nothing I can do to change that, as much as I may want to. But it also had nothing to do with my performance or my talent, who I am as a person. That's about him. Those are things he's projected onto me. That's not to say that, sometimes he might just not have liked my style. Maybe he didn't think my work was good. That may be valid as well. But there are times where the former is true. And
it's an interesting point. It's an interesting point to kind of get past that and just look at.
And that happens with presidents too. And political candidates, people look at them and they're like, I don't like the way he speaks. I don't like the color of his skin. What they call him, the orange man, or people make all sorts. I don't like the way he combs his hair. And you'll say, oh, they're not voting based on that, but people are, we're fascinating beings. We make decisions based on all sorts of things that we're not always conscious of.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because I'll be clear. I definitely, it doesn't matter to you, right? But it absolutely matters to me when I evaluate someone politically. I've even said to people, I'm like, if you're, to me, the kind of person you are is definitely a third of it for me with a leader. I go, who are you as a human?
Right.
And then I go, who are you in terms of, do you line up with my, I guess you would call it sort of my, what would you call it? Your values in terms of where you want the country to go. Right. And then I go, who are you in terms of, do I think you have good judgment and stuff like that? So I go for those three things. But I mean, I do think it's a real,
the last one first.
For that. And so for you, it would be like, okay, I'm going to look at what you're going to do policy wise, and I'm going to look at judgment, but I'm going to leave off anything that I think about your personality.
I don't know.
Or at least it's third. It's last on the list.
Right. It's not going to be the top priority.
Well, let's get it. So let's
Yeah.
get into some of these other things, because
Yeah.
here's the thing. Part of the reason I like talking to you is because you obviously have a background in politics that I don't have. You and I also share a love of philosophy. You're incredibly well read, and also we both share, sort of a background in psychology, and you're incredibly well read there. So we've talked a little bit about sort of these differences and distinctions, which I think are important, because as you all are listening to this, to me, part of the reason I like having these conversations with Courtenay is because I think Courtenay's very balanced. I think she comes at it slightly different than I do. Some of you, she's right in line with you. Some of you are listening and I'm right in line with you. But isn't it nice to have a conversation where we can just say, let's look at it from this point of view? So here's another point of view I want to sort of address with you, because you have an understanding of politics and sort of geopolitical issues and all these kind of things that I think a lot of us don't, especially historically speaking, in terms of your background and understanding what a liberal is, what is a conservative, what are the histories of these things, and what does socialism actually mean. So here's one way that I'm going to just present this and then have you kind of educate me on sort of how you see it. One of the things you said in this conversation was really about the ideals of the United States, and sort of the at least the policies of Roosevelt and things like that you feel like may not have been sort of the best for our country. And this to me is an argument we're having now when people throw around things like socialism, like Bernie Sanders is a crazy socialist, and Donald Trump is whatever they call him, or some white supremacist neo-Nazi, whatever they call him, right? So we tend to have these extreme languages, and then we essentially go and we say, all right, well, if the United States, to your point, is that it sounds like, and I don't know, I won't pin you down, but it sounds like you're saying we are the best country. We're not perfect, but we're the best country the way you see it. And then I come along and I say, I don't think we are. Mm-hmm. And part of me goes, okay, so who's right? And then I go, well, I'm a scientist, and you tend to think that way as well. So don't we have data somewhere that we can look at to essentially say, is there a way that we can measure? There's a lot of countries who've done a lot of different things. I think we can say, like, okay, well, communism didn't work. You know what I mean? Like, we can see that it did not work. We can see others.
We have tens of millions of corpses to prove it.
Absolutely.
Enough for me.
Fascism didn't work. We've tried some of these things, right? But here's where I go now, and I want to see, and I think I've talked to you about this off camera, or but I'll just say it for everyone. The way I look at this and try to do this, I tend to take an evidence-based approach and say, okay, where are the best countries on earth? And I just go, we have statistics on this. Who tends to be the happiest? Who tends to have the highest, gross domestic product and things like that? Better economies, lower unemployment, entrepreneurial spirit, right? Safety nets for the poor people, all these things. And to me, I go, okay, that is not the United States. We're like 30 on the list. We're up there, but we're not in the top 10 in most of these things. Like people think we're just not, right? I mean, maybe you'll correct me if they say, no, Jade, we are. But from my perspective, happiness, we're not. Unemployment, we're not. In terms of economic, stability for our people, and economic disparity is, I guess, the word I'm looking for. Meaning the rich versus the poor and that kind of thing. We're not. Healthcare, we're not.
Healthcare, we're high.
Are we up in the top 10? Okay. So, but here's sort of the case here, and this is why I like talking, because you're going to be like
quality versus
yeah. So, but I go, all right. So I think these are, and you've heard me say this before, but I think these are Norway, Sweden, Finland, New Zealand. It's these countries, and to me, then when I look at what are those countries doing, I go, these are capitalist countries who have experimented with going all the way socialist in the 70s, didn't go too well for them, have come back onto the other side, and now seem to be having merging socialist things with, they have free healthcare and things like that with capitalist societies, and seem to be doing well. So where is my thought process going wrong there? That why aren't we trying to duplicate some of what these countries are doing?
So most of them fall into social democracy. So a lot of people think of them as being, socialist. They're the argument for socialism, but no, socialism, as we've seen, has always led to communism, fascism, which are really two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And costs millions of lives. That's not a direction that I would argue has any merit. But they're more of a, as you pointed out, they do have capitalistic free markets. So that is part of where their, I would argue, their rising success is coming from. However, there is still, in terms of, you pointed out happiness, and I have seen some of the studies on, and it's hard to measure, like what is happiness, right?
Yeah, it's extremely hard to measure. And basically what they're doing is just giving a bunch of forms to say, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? What is your stress related to finances? What are your blah, blah, blah?
Exactly. And I would argue, and this is really just my own personal projection onto it, it's not any kind of an authoritative claim, but I would say a lot of what they're measuring is contentment. And yes, there is some, there's a lot of evidence that's even been pointed out and studied in this country that once you need a certain, and when you talk about your philosophy, the base level human, right? You need a certain income before, just not to be in constant state of where your base needs are met, basically. And, so that addresses the contentment. But, and I talk about this a lot, as human beings, we need a certain degree of challenge. I love, I always point to Viktor Frankl's quote that, what man needs is not a tensionless state, but, a challenge worthy of him. Yeah. And and I think the Stoics have a really similar one, which is if he pities he who has never met adversity, for he doesn't know what he's capable of. And I think this really points to human beings need meaning. You talk a lot about this. Meaning, purpose, and there are different variations of a similar thing. But happiness is a very fleeting kind of, it's more about contentment. It's I think, not to say that we don't want happiness, but it's not, I don't think we're not working our whole lives to find happiness.
And if we are, is it even possible?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, so that may be true, just to, that they may score high on those tests. But what you don't see is tremendous immigration to those countries. You're not seeing people, a waiting list trying to get into those countries. You do see a lot of people from those countries leaving and coming here. You also don't see a whole lot of ingenuity coming out of there. That's not to say there's none, I mean, I know lots of people from this country, and they're wonderful, they're incredible. I've been there, there's some really great things to be said. I think there's great things to be said about all parts of this world. This planet is pretty incredible. And the fact that we have human beings on it is, pretty amazing, right? But I think the argument for Western civilization and for what this country, opens up for people, there's a reason we've got a waiting list. There's a reason we have such a hard time, with adjudicating what do we do with our borders and how do we account for the fact that so many people want to be here. That says something, right? People don't want, and that even our haters, quote unquote haters, won't leave. I say this all the time to people who are America sucks, we're doing everything wrong. Great, get out of here. Like why are you staying here? But really, would you have somebody come into your home and be like, I hate the way you decorated everything. Why on earth would you do this why would you put this table here? And just trashing everything you've done to build this place, which I think is beautiful, by the way. But would you stand for that? You'd be like, well, fine, get out of here,
I mean, my personality probably be like, well, what do you think I should do? You don't like the way I decorated? But no, I totally get your point.
But if you cook a meal for somebody, they're like, this is awful. You don't have to eat it, and there is something to be said for that a lot of people. So I'll wrap up my point. My point is that I think that says a lot. There's also just the tremendous amount of ingenuity, inventiveness, and the things that, the term American excellence comes from somewhere. It comes from the fact that we have been pioneers in so much. And the reason for that is this value that we place on the individual. And we allow the individual to have the opportunity to discover what they're made of. Yeah. And that is really pretty special. And
you think that's unique to the United States and not no other countries at this point?
I do think it's really, yes. I think there are other parts of the West that absolutely do have that, but not to the same degree. There's an element of freedom here. Even parts of, Britain, there's other, or even Canada, where you have like, you do have some of these freedoms. You don't have the same kind of free speech and freedom of thought and free enterprise that we have here. And that's part of why people say we're the leaders of the free world, because it's the freedom. That's what we celebrated yesterday, Independence Day. It's our freedom.
That's right. Yeah, it's July 5th right now as we're having this conversation.